Welcome to the Spark of Ages podcast. Today, we're joined by Matt Bigge, a partner at Crosslink Capital. Matt's been crushing it in the investing world for over 25 years, and his track record speaks for itself. He's backed winners like Veridan, sold to F.I.R.E, ArcSight, sold to HP, and CloudShield, sold to SAIC. He was even a founding investor and chair of Mesh Networks, which Motorola snatched up. Before he was writing checks and building tech empires, he was serving our country as an infantry officer in the 10th Mountain Division. We're talking full airborne and Ranger qualified. This guy helped detain Haitian dictator Joe Raul Cedras when he was just 24 years old. Talk about starting your career with a bang. When he's not hunting for the next unicorn or advising government and private sector leaders on cybersecurity, Matt's living his other passion, baseball. And we mean serious baseball. His son actually made it to the major leagues with the Cubs after being drafted in 2019, and now he plays for the Tampa Bay Rays. Armed with degrees from Georgetown and Harvard Business School and based in the San Francisco Bay Area, Matt's also deeply committed to giving back through the Honor Foundation, helping special operations veterans transition to civilian careers. Some of the key takeaways you can expect from this episode: the impact of low-cost versus high-cost defense systems, how the U.S. is rebuilding our supply chains for defense and the logistical challenges faced by defense startups, strategies employed by startups like Crossbow and Darkhive to disrupt traditional prime defense contractors, and finally, how Matt's interest in plausible science fiction influences his investment approach. Matt, welcome to the Spark of Ages.
Chief, great to be here. Thanks for having me. It's always fun catching up.
All right. Well, we're going to continue that fun conversation that you and I always seem to have. And what really excited me about having you here, you bring this very unique perspective as a venture capitalist, as a business leader, because you served in the military, but you're a true deep tech geek. But you then understand how to turn that into leadership. And so into leadership and investing and purpose. And so I wanted to bring all that to my audience. So let's start with a little bit of what's happening today. So there's a conflict in Ukraine, as you know well. And what's interesting about it is that they're faced with an overwhelming militarily superior power. And they have innovated and in ways that are just unbelievable, as you'd find in many military conflicts, but in this one, it's especially poignant. They've demonstrated the impact of low-cost expendable systems like drones and loitering munitions. How has this shift influenced your perspective on investing in high-cost, exquisite platforms versus numerous low-cost autonomous systems?
Well, I don't think you want to think about this in terms of cost. I mean, ultimately, cost does matter, but really about 10 years ago when I joined Crosslink, not quite 10 years ago, we sat down and did a lot of work thinking through how do you make an impact? What are the challenges that I saw both as a soldier, decades ago, but then also when I was CEO of my last company, which was a small defense contractor, and we were running business operations in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and a variety of other places you don't go on vacation. And what it boiled down to was the future requires systems that are modular, that are interoperable with one another, and they're responsive. So we can break that down. Modularity. Things need to be plug and play. You can take components from one system and use them in another. It's kind of like blocks of software, because I think most people in the startup and venture world think in terms of software. But there's no reason why a UAV from one vendor cannot use the exact same interface as a UAV from another vendor if you're plugging in a thermal camera or other ISR, reconnaissance capability. Interoperable. These systems need to be able to communicate with one another independent of who the prime is, independent of who the technology provider is. We have too many walled gardens throughout our national security infrastructure, and these walled gardens lead to a slowdown in communications and that degrades combat effectiveness. And ultimately, what you want to build are products that enable the warfighter to do their job and enable the enterprise that supports the warfighter. And that requires interoperability. In addition to that, interoperability is critical for the military to run at machine speed. Too often, the battlefield runs at human speed while our adversaries are running at machine speed. And that's where autonomy comes into play. The last is responsive. We no longer can afford to take, the average of 6.6 years to create a program of record. The average program of record from the day it gets talked about in the Pentagon to the day that you field an initial capability is 6.6 years.
That's crazy.
Average.
That's a long time.
Yeah, like what is the technology cycle?
And then many of them, like some of the fighter jets, these are 20+ year programs, right, before they get to production.
Right. And so they are by definition obsolete before they're in the hands of the warfighter. And our adversaries do not require 3 technology cycles to deploy one capability. If we think about something that was spec'd out to require artificial intelligence in 2019, all right, that was basic machine learning. And, in today's world, things like generative AI are informing autonomy in ways that allow us to function at machine speed versus human speed.
So now take that to the situation in Ukraine. It's not, yes, it is. There are low cost drones, right? There's drones that are made with toys or toy components from China. I mean, right? A lot of the microcontrollers and those things, right? And then there's this massive sort of disruptive impact where these low cost items put together in large numbers in a well-trained system are taking out much more expensive weapons, like 100x, 1000x times, right? A $200 device is taking out a $100 million system. So if you were to look at it from that perspective, is this because people were thinking about this before, or is this an adaptation?
Well, it's an adaptation. I mean, it's when you're forced by an existential threat to come up with solutions, you get pretty creative. And hats off to everyone in the Ukraine because they've demonstrated, incredible creativity, incredible intestinal fortitude. It's pretty cool the way people have found a way to stay alive and fight back and actually inflict some pretty significant damage on, as you pointed out, a much more, financially well-backed adversary. And, when you look at that, it reminds me of a book I read in undergrad by Che Guevara on guerrilla warfare. And when you look at the way Che changed the way the Soviets implemented guerrilla warfare back in the 60s and 70s, it took us a while to figure that out. Now, ultimately, the Cold War turned out the way it turned out, and Che didn't meet with a very pleasant end. But that playbook is largely what we're seeing out of the Ukrainians. It's also what we're seeing out of the Houthis.
Yeah.
It's what we're seeing out of a number of, nation state and non-nation state adversaries that are forced to function without fancy, exquisite systems that spent decades getting spec'd out and more decades before they went into production. And that's where, you get back to MIR, modular, interoperable, responsive. It's got to be responsive within the technology cycle. It's got to be able to interoperate and communicate. And, to me, that's the future of the defense sector.
In a way, because they were forced to be in that situation, they didn't have all the setup and the infrastructure. They were forced into that situation. And that's because we had we had these electronic systems that can be cleverly utilized. So now let's take it a bit further, right? So one of the other areas I'd love to chat with you about is that the notion of the current supply chain base, right? So, right, we have the notion of modernizing defense production, right? And you've invested in a company called Crossbow that's using an additive manufacturing approach for single rocket motors, right? So they are additive manufacturing. That's printing, 3D printing. So how far along? So a lot of folks will say, well, the U.S. has hollowed out its industrial base and supply chains. And you'll say that, and there's a lot of logistical challenges as a result, right? I'm a startup and I'm trying to take advantage of whatever I have here in the U.S. I can't just necessarily draw from what's moved overseas. How do you think about that in terms of modernizing our production base?
Well, I mean, it's about modernizing the production base so that we're actually putting the best and the latest and greatest capabilities into the hands of the men and women who defend our country. And we have gotten lazy about things. When you look at the world of solid state energetics, so you have two types of rockets, ones that use liquids and ones that use solids. There's like a few hybrids in there, but for the purposes of this, liquid versus solid. Liquid, gas goes in your car. That's a liquid. The rocket that you built in third grade, and shot up in the air, like that had a little solid, thing of gunpowder.
Yeah, it's like fireworks. Right. It's like fireworks.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. That's solid state. And solid state motors, actually, most of the rockets that get shot around this world are solid state rockets. And they're really, prior to about 6 years ago, there had not been a meaningful patent filed, in my lifetime. I'm not young. There's no non-gray hair on my head. And so that tells me that even if the capability is great, the ability to manufacture the capability is not. And that gets to being responsive, being modular, being interoperable. And I think where Crossbow has seen a lot of commercial success has been the ability to respond to customer requirements in very, very short order. When you look at the incumbents in this market, you have to, very, very long lead times on orders. And you have, very large scale, like they basically have mixing bowls the size of a 4-story office building. They fill them up with chemicals and then they, turn them into rocket motors. As opposed to Crossbow, they have a program with the Air Force where you can just 3D print these motors in a shipping container, like anywhere in the world. It's pretty cool. And turns out you don't have to order that 9 months or a year in advance. But I think, it's one of the natural tendencies in this conversation is to bash the legacy primes. But the reality is they've got to all work together. And where that can be very symbiotic is the large primes are incredibly good at communicating with Capitol Hill. They're very good at managing very complex, large programs. They have exceptional past performance, which allows them bidding preferences. But generally speaking, the best technology, it's found in Silicon Valley. It's found in El Segundo. It's found in Austin, Texas. It's found outside the R&D facilities of the large primes, and frankly, even some of the federally funded research and development centers. And, prior to 9/11, over half of research and development in this country was funded by the DoD. Today, that number is less than 18%. So, and it's because 9/11 happened and all of our spend shifted to immediate operational requirements as opposed to research and development. What we've seen over the last 10 years is the rise of venture-backed national security-focused businesses. I've been investing in national security-focused businesses since the 90s. And historically, that hasn't been the place where
No,
you go
that
find the next unicorn.
this was not the next sexy Amazon or right or
No, but
the
neither was cybersecurity
right.
25 years ago,
Right. So I
right?
mean
So
you had to see it a
yeah,
bit earlier, right? I mean that was that was the thing. It's like you had to see, I think, what you're talking about, this notion of modular, interoperable, responsive. You had to see it, the need for that prior to that, because even your crossbow investment is not the last 3 years, right? This is like
yeah, it was 2019 is when
2019, right?
we
It's
were the
but they
first
were in development
institutional
even
investors.
before that, right? They were in development way before that, right? So
The idea was before that, but we were their first capital.
that's
So
right.
that's when it went from really good ideas to really good ideas put into motion.
Yeah.
And, and that's where, you look at a company and, from basically zero 6 years ago to hundreds of millions of dollars in bookings. And that means, number one, they've built something useful. And number two, the customers find it useful, which, we all go back to business 101. You got to have a capability, people who want the capability, budgets that those people have consistent with the capability, and then the ability to have a contract vehicle that can do numbers 1, 3, 3. If you got all
Yeah.
four of those things, you might have a business.
Right.
If you don't, if you're missing any one of those things, you
Right,
got
but
nothing.
but you have to see it, right? And so there's this
Yeah,
combination of seeing it from your personal lens, and then seeing it from the folks that you're talking with, and so this is a situation where you like it's kind of like the SpaceX. I think the audience may understand as sort of like United Launch Alliance, which is Boeing and Lockheed's rather slow moving rocket building capability that was very reliable but very expensive, versus SpaceX doing it less expensively, much, like, so what, like 75% off per rocket launch, right? And coming up with super clever ideas about how to reuse rockets, right? You had to see the same thing in the defense world with the rocket that can be manufactured in a
on
kit
demand.
on demand on a site versus off at a big location, right?
Well,
You
we
had to
have a
see
big
some of that.
location too, but
That's true.
even there, it's continuous throughput. And again, that's this gets back to you know responsive requires taking a greenfield look at things, and just like we do in any venture category or any startup category, really, it's all right. This is how the world does it. Well, how should we be doing it in light of modern technology, in light of modern capabilities?
Yeah, and that led you to see these sorts of things. So let's go to talk a little bit about AI, right? And so there's the rise of AI agents. There's there are tons of sensors out there of all types. Um, so there's data coming from all those sensors coming to the warfighter, right? And so that warfighter or the team has to make sense of it in the context of a highly disruptive battlefield. Right? There's massive volume. There's a lot of things coming at you. As one of our guests, Jason Hansberger told us, right? He's a Air Force colonel now doing work at Stanford to help bring Silicon Valley and the military together. It's not like driving your full self-driving system in a friendly, city street, right? Where everybody has rules to get somewhere. You're in a complex world, right? Where
Right, you're in a
everyone's
complex
against you.
world,
So
right?
now you have to make sense of it, right? And so how do you see these AI powered automation and augmentation capabilities coming together to help the warfighter that may be potentially overwhelmed by all this data?
Well, you're absolutely going to be overwhelmed by this data. And that is why I talk about the future requires functioning at machine speed, not human speed. Because the human brain is not going to be able to handle those inputs at a pace that's going to keep up with what's going on in the rest of the battlefield. And so when you think about the tactical, operational, and strategic systems that we employ as a nation to defend our country, you know, increasingly they must all operate at machine speed, and that requires interoperability of systems, which is, a big challenge that we face in terms of modernizing our national security infrastructure. The good news is we've got great minds, great entrepreneurs out there doing it. And I think increasingly the large primes understand that if they're going to be successful in the future and maintain their market share, they're going to find ways to partner with these emerging technology companies so that everybody's doing what they're best at. Crossbow, I believe, has, awesomely wonderful solid state energetics technology and capabilities. And these larger primes, increasingly, their organic ability to produce those materials is outdated. So if they want to service their customers the best way they possibly can, they're going to partner with these up and coming innovators that I believe the Forged Act calls them non-traditional providers, which was a term coined by Silicon Valley Defense Group. And SVDG is, I was a founding board member there, and we do a lot of work helping the Pentagon understand what the state of the art is and where to find it. We also do a lot of work educating Capitol Hill on what's the state of the art and where to find it. I think we still have some changes that need to be made in the procurement world.
I'm sure that's a significant process, but that's part of it, right? So just to go back a little bit, what Crossbow allows is I can now make my rocket on the battlefield, right?
Well, it's the motor. It's not the whole rocket.
Well, not the rocket. You have the explosive and then you have the rocket. You can make it at the battlefield or in forward locations as opposed to getting it shipped all the way from somewhere. So that's an incredible innovation in and of itself. Right. And then I think you have an investment in this firm called Darkhive, which is in the area of drones and drone management, where now you can have them working together as a swarm, working autonomously or semi-autonomously to get to where to fulfill a particular mission, so that if they're somehow blocked by other communications technology, they can make things happen. Right. Yep. So these are capabilities that are Silicon Valley-esque capabilities that are combined with a military need to get people to where they want to go. Right. And so this is how all this is coming together.
Right. And it's a great founder market fit story where you have a former Navy combat tech who I met when he graduated the Honor Foundation Transition Program back in 2018, kept track of him. He had a job with a large contractor, did that for a while, learned how the system works from the contractor end, because he'd already seen the problem on the ground, in combat zones. And so when John was building his business, his question was, why are we deploying, a $150,000 drone to do a reconnaissance mission when if we take a step back and build it using consumer electronics methodologies as opposed to exquisite system methodologies, we can build that exact same drone and sell it for 20 grand or less. And, that was the aha for him. I think what we've realized with the company over time is that, yes, those drones are going to sell like hotcakes, but the software that makes them run is what really allows the battlefield to run at machine speed rather than human speed. And then when you think about the interoperability, it's building the hardware and the software with an open systems approach so that it can communicate both up and down. They can certainly communicate with the soldiers on the ground, but it can also interface with the software that informs higher headquarters at the operational and strategic level. So, thinking through that modular, interoperable, and responsive framework, you take a consumer electronics approach to building these systems. That's going to radically lower cost. It's also going to materially enhance the manufacturability of the UAV. And by doing that, you become much more responsive. It's not place an order, wait 6 months, take delivery, go out and train on it. Maybe it all works. Whereas with Darkive, it's, yeah, what do you want? All right, well, Amazon Prime. I mean,
Right.
not quite that easy.
It's kind of like
but
it's pure sense and respond, right? As the market demands it, and like you're saying, it changes the way you procure, right? The traditional procurement system has changed, and to the Defense Department's credit, they've had DARPA and other clever ways of working with industry, and I think you guys have, through your Silicon Valley group, have helped to change some of the legislation so that you enable these firms or the primes. Explain a quick thing about primes. A prime is?
So Prime is a systems integrator. So you think about the big ones: Lockheed, RTX, Boeing, Northrop, SAIC, Booz Allen. These are large companies. They control about 30% of all defense contracts, over 50% of the large defense contracts, because rightly, our federal government is not going to trust a $100 billion program to some startup with 8 people and maybe a dog wandering around the office. Because when you build these things, they have to work. This is not, hey, we have 99% uptime, we're good to go.
Yeah.
We're talking 5 nines reliability, 9 nines reliability. There have been some incidents over the last few years where startups, don't stand up to the reliability and, just downtime requirements that you have with a military specification. We all love to make fun of the $500 hammer, and that is silly. But at the end of the day, if, I think back to when I was an infantry officer, if I pick up my, back then M16 and it jams every 10 rounds, I'm not using it.
Yeah.
Like
a 90% success rate is not good enough.
Yeah, you're going to die. And when you look at these systems, not 5 nines reliability in a network system, that equates to about 6 minutes of downtime per year. And that is on the border of acceptable in a military system because, the idea is that we're going to win and, we're not just going to use stuff that enhances our ability to die. So that's
the reason for this notion of the prime contractor. They've been certified. They have the systems in place. So that it's easier for the government to work with them directly, and then for them to vet these other companies that they might put on that contract, right? Is that
absolutely?
The idea? So if I'm coming
providers,
right? So what the game for if I'm going to be an entrepreneur or build a defense tech company, it's probably eventually I may either work through a prime or through one of the exceptions that I think you've worked on.
Right. And so there are ways to sell direct. And it depends on what you're doing. I mean, if you're selling discrete widgets, you can be what's called a merchant supplier. And as a merchant supplier to the government, you might sell through a prime, you might sell direct to the government. And that usually involves selling discrete things as opposed to systems. Now there are, younger companies, growth stage businesses that aspire to be the next generation of primes. You look at something like Anduril. They're not in it to sell through Lockheed. They're in it to be bigger than Lockheed. And, and that's a longer journey. There's a lot of benefit to it. And I think we do need some upstart primes. Once upon a time, SAIC was an upstart prime. And so there are different ways to skin the cat, but, if you're going to be selling autonomous systems, you're going to want to work with, the large primes that hold the large contracts so they can more easily on-ramp you. You get that past performance so that you can then become eligible to bid as a prime on your own program of record.
So there's a whole system that we need to have that's available that you've helped put together with, with like-minded folks. So it's not just closed off like most would think.
Everything in the world is hard until you learn how to do it. And then it's just work. And whether you're trying to sell into the Fortune 500 with enterprise software, well, the first time you sell in the Fortune 500, it's really, really,
it's
really
freaking hard. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you learn how to do it. You build a playbook and, over time you refine that playbook and then it's just work. And very similar to that, when you look at, our defense budget, going to be about $1 trillion by the time this thing gets through reconciliation. That's over 5x the GDP of the Ukraine.
Yeah.
Like our defense budget is 5 times that country's GDP, actually a little more. So
yeah, I think it's it's bigger than the next 10.
At least. Yeah. I mean, it's rough. It's about 40% of global defense. Yeah. I mean, global defense spending is 2.7 trillion. We're $1 trillion. So it's the kind of thing where this is a very, very large enterprise. And if you're thinking about it as an entrepreneur, identifying what is my total addressable market, whether it's hardware or software, you've got dozens of Fortune 500 size budgets inside the U.S. national security infrastructure. And people think about the government as a solitary or a one customer. Oh, you have concentration risk because you just sell the DoD. Well, the DoD has hundreds of potential customers. So you have concentration risk if the only thing you're selling into is, one program. Like if everything you do is going into the Joint Strike Fighter, all right, that's customer concentration risk. But if you're selling through, I have a portfolio company that's they're part of 28 different programs of record. That's not concentration risk. That is rational spread of programs, rational revenue diversification. And so, that's where the venture world is just coming online with understanding how to diversify revenue appropriately without even leaving the U.S. government.
Yeah. So that's a great way of putting it, right? There's so many different ways, so many different potential buyers within this. So when I'm thinking about go to market, right, to them, there's a whole way that there's a mechanism to get you there. There's a mechanism so that there's not concentration risk. And do I think about net dollar retention? Do I think about NRR? Is that what they're putting up in their slides?
It's much longer. No.
When I go to a board meeting with Matt Bigge, am I talking about NRR, NDR?
Maybe on the cybersecurity side of the portfolio, but no, it does matter though. When the government can kick you out of contracts if you're bad at what you do, and it happens. You see contracts terminated for convenience. That is a phrase that nobody wants to hear, and you do see this happening, particularly when products don't hit reliability standards. There's a reason why it takes so long to get a missile qualified or to get a safety system qualified. I don't want the parachute that was slapped together and is going to work 90% of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I have no problem if, I buy a box of pens and only 9 out of 10 of those pens has ink. Like, all right, that sucked, but I can get over it. But if my parachute only opens 90% of the time, hey, we got a problem.
Even 99 is not good enough. All right, let's talk about one of your favorite topics, which is plausible science fiction. Okay, so how does that inform your investment decisions in cutting edge national security areas like hypersonics or energetics or autonomous systems? How do you discern between plausible future tech and pure fantasy?
I'd say number one, the future is way closer than people realize. When you look at these kind of things, you want to understand, have the basic science challenges been overcome? And then it's a function of, all right, are we still inventing novel capabilities, or are we into the engineering phase where we're refining a capability to turn into something that can be used in the world around us for business, national security, whatever? And actually, I'll go with a company that you haven't named, Alira. Alira is a company that we spun out of a lab at Harvard in 2019. And they basically make an SD-WAN product where the security mechanism is quantum entanglement. And when I first met the company, they had had a breakthrough. An undergrad student working with Professor Pri Narang had figured out a way to predict gate failures in quantum systems. It turns out that that little breakthrough allows you to sustain a communication connection that is essentially unhackable. And when you think about the post-quantum encryption world, unhackable systems are going to be pretty critical, because there's no, right now,
right. So
look at
just to help everyone
encryption.
understand, WAN is wide area network. So wide area network, we're trying to communicate across the networks today have been built on TCP/IP, and that was the original networking system. There's a lot of companies in cybersecurity at every single level: network security, application security, cloud security. I mean, there's, you name it, there's all these companies, right? And everybody keeps talking about post-quantum computing as a way.
Well, none of our encryption works right now.
Well, I mean, I got 5 or 6 different clients that keep talking about post-quantum, right? Being essentially unhackable, because with quantum, I can break the cryptographic code, right? And so you found this cool company that in the quantum space that had a bead to around it, right? Quantum has been science fiction for a long time. Right? It's always kind of like fusion. It's always 10 years out or whatever. Right. So, but in this one, you found something where there was a practical application.
Well, not only a practical application,
or doable application.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, the first time I sat down with the professor, I was like, this is nonsense. Like, this is 5 to 10 years out. What I discovered was the research has been done. And then we had a couple of years of development where we were refining, can we make this work in a manner that it can be useful to businesses and governments? And that took a couple of years. And then once you do that, it's about engineering, where you're taking that R&D and turning it into a product. For better or worse, I began my venture career running around research and development labs, defense contractors, and, federal labs, trying to find cool intellectual property that appeared to have business utility. And so a lot of my early investing was in companies where we were taking R&D and making it useful. And so that kind of informed why I like going into these things really, really, really early, because I understand how that evolution works. And when I sat down with Professor Narang in Harvard in 2019, it was really quantum entanglement. Yeah, good job. All right. But yeah, great to meet you.
Great idea. Yeah. Just like a lot of I've talked to a lot of professors that, their wet lab innovation is just ready to be commercialized, right?
Ready to go. But the longer I spent learning about it, the more I realized, all right, the future's a lot closer than we think. And this is something that could have legs.
So do you like read science fiction books, and that informs some of your thinking? Are you looking for things like that? Is there a pattern recognition sort of inbuilt in your head that, wow, that I read about this cool stuff when I was reading, Prelude to the Foundation, and now it comes out today. And I see it today.
I mean, well, if you read Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, and read the whole book, it's a short book, and then look at the year it was copyrighted, your jaw will hit the floor. There's a reason why Neil Stephenson was one of the first advisors to Jeff Bezos for Blue Origin. Like, the guy has seen the future and frequently gets it right, or close enough to right. So I do read a ton of science fiction, but I also read a ton of white papers, and I am very much always on the lookout for where the future is closer than people generally believe it is. I think,
and so that's how you build the connection. You may have something way out there, like somebody might read Ray Kurzweil years ago, and he was maybe a little aggressive initially with what's going to happen with AI and the singularity and all that, but
heck, Leon Cooper at
he
Brown
wasn't wrong.
in the 70s and 80s.
We're getting there. Yeah.
I mean, the term neural network, I believe it was coined in 1979.
Right.
At Brown, a guy named Leon Cooper, Nobel Prize winner. And so that was a 40-year journey before that basic research turned into something useful. Now, I think a lot of that had to do with the ecosystem around it, because the principles of neural networks have not changed a ton, but the bandwidth, the compute, the memory,
having the cloud essentially enables it to move so much faster, right? I mean, that
or having this little device in our hands that's more powerful than any computer on Earth in 1979.
Right. So all that brings it together, and so you have to be able to see all that, and you'll make mistakes, and some, but you have to be more. I guess you have to be 10% right on a home run.
I mean, the power law theory does work. That's I think if you look at the history of our funds, it's we have plenty of singles and doubles, and that's great, and that's great for the entrepreneurs, great for the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and it's wonderful for us and our investors. But ultimately, when you have a real home run of a fund, it's because you have a few of those outliers.
Okay, so Matt, this was awesome. Now we're going to have some more fun, and we're going to go to the Spark Tank. So here we go. Welcome to the Spark Tank, where we ignite the unexpected connections that fuel go-to-market innovation and occasionally set fire to conventional business thinking. Today, we're thrilled to have Matt Bigge, a true deep tech investor capitalist, a man whose career reads something like Mad Libs with a LinkedIn profile and accidentally created a superhero origin story. This is the ultimate word association challenge, where we're going to dig through decades of your brain's filing cabinet and see what fascinating connections fall out. Every response could either drop some leadership gold, reveal the secret sauce of team building, or accidentally pitch the next unicorn startup in science fiction investing. Here's how it works. I'll start with a word, and Matt, you'll respond with the first word that pops into your head. No military precision required, just pure stream of consciousness brilliance. Then I'll respond, and we'll keep this chain of associations flowing, maybe 2 or 3 times back and forth. And then I might ask you a question about it. Okay, ready to see where your battle-tested synapses take us?
Let's go.
All right, here we go, Matt. Mission.
What needs to happen?
Purpose.
Leaving the world better than you found it.
Do you have a couple of favorite companies that embrace that notion of mission and leaving the world a better place?
LearnLux. Financial wellness training as a benefit. This is something that's changing the lives of millions of employees around the world, of large companies that use the LearnLux platform so that their employees are better able to manage their day-to-day personal lives, which makes them better at their job. So lots of Fortune 500 customers, very exciting company that is absolutely leaving the world better than they found it.
Awesome. All right, we'll do the next one. Destroyer.
Creative destruction.
Battleship.
Slow.
Musk. I wouldn't say slow for Musk. I'd say Lockheed for slow.
Yeah, the big primes, yes and no, and they're so slow at so many things.
Give me one word.
All right.
Twist around my thinking.
What's the word? What's the association you're starting with again?
Destroyer.
Let's say innovator.
So this is like this philosophy for leadership, right? It's destroyer could be a battleship. It could be something where we look at things from first principles.
Well, and that's where I go is creative destruction, where you have to look at the world from a first principles standpoint and understand, all right, if we chuck out all the legacy baggage, what do we really need here? How would we do it if we're building a greenfield system?
So what happens when you're going through that process of thinking things from first principles or destroying things, there's this point of, well, why are things the way they are today? Right. And so there's that point where you're making the flip from moving from one to the next, and you're wondering why everyone else hasn't thought of it.
Right. Well, and that's where you have to understand the history of innovation in a given sector and other sectors so that you can think through, all right, how has something been disrupted in the past, and what were the conditions that turned the tide from the old way to the new way? What are the set of unit economics, or what are the series of human behaviors? Like, unit economics did not drive the rise of smartphones. That was driven by human behavior and putting novel capabilities into people's hands in a manner that nobody could have foreseen the potential out of it. It just felt like, we give them all these cool toys, they're going to make them useful. So there are different types of creative destruction, as opposed to, let's go from buggies to cars.
Yeah,
like that was a long
what I would
evolution.
say in that period of putting the massive investment in and going from one to the other, I don't know about you, but there's that period where you're like, you wake up every morning with a cold sweat and say, did I make the right choice? I put a lot of people into this, a lot of money into this.
I think a lot.
Or maybe I'm the only. I can't be the only one that wakes up with a cold sweat.
Oh, now there's a lot of capital running around, so very seldom do entrepreneurs really put their own net worth at risk. But when you do, there's a lot of. I mean, you're a small business owner, not so small anymore, and if billings are off, who's writing the check, Rajiv?
That's right.
Payroll's getting covered.
What's going on?
So I've been there too, and your wife gives you a pretty really, or are we writing that check?
Why did you not sell the company? Okay, next one.
Yeah.
All right, this one's an interesting one because we talked about it a little earlier. China.
Fundamentally different. They come
opposite,
at the world.
Yeah, opposite. So you're.
Well, I'd say opposite. It's just a whole of society approach.
Cultural.
It's a cultural thing. I mean, it's they take a whole of society approach. We have generally we separate business and government. I mean, that's starting to change, but. I had a company I was a CEO of once where we got hacked by Huawei, and they were trying to steal a proposal on a contract we were competing against them on. I called the FBI, and they said, we have no jurisdiction, and you should probably invest in better cybersecurity tooling. I was like, well, great. That makes me feel awesome about my tax bill. And it was even in the spring. It was I was on my way to my son's baseball game when he was in high school, and I get a call from my IT guy saying, hey, I just unplugged everything. And I'm like, I'm going to write a check to the IRS in about 2 or 3 weeks.
And so, what it is that you're paying the government to do certain things. You have this expectation of some protection, and then you have another one that is a government sponsor of that's actually doing this on behalf of their businesses, which I think is where you're going with this.
Yeah, I mean, back then the Chinese government owned 30% of Huawei, so that to me is state sponsored and.
Yeah.
Suboptimal. We wouldn't do that, or at least we claim we don't do it. So.
Yeah. And I think there's the benefit of, there's the tough side, and there's the benefit in terms of they do things at such scale that some of the technologies we're utilizing today have come down to such a low cost that it can be widespread, like solar, right? Or batteries, right? So there's a plus minus, and I guess we're trying to figure out a happy medium.
Yeah, I think that's well phrased.
Okay, let's have some more. We'll end this with a little fun. Old fashioned.
Cocktail.
Favorite.
Oof. I mean, the degenerate in me says gambling, but Yeah, old fashioned's my favorite cocktail. So you just put them both together.
There you go. Yeah. So you're gaming, old fashioned. I love going to the Gotham Club and getting the old fashioned with the 24, the baseball with the 24 on it. I brought my daughter to that the other day and I was like, check this out. It was so much fun.
That's pretty cool. Got to get a 43 on that.
Oh, yeah. We got to get 43. There we go. There we go. A little bit of hunter on that. So there we
That's
go.
right.
Awesome. Matt, did you always know you wanted to work in technology? Was there like a specific moment or project that sparked your passion in defense technology? What got you sparked? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was always kind of really, really interested in international relations. And I did kind of get into computers at a very, very young age, may or may not have done some youthful hacking. That statute of limitations is probably expired on.
I think you're okay now. Maybe. I don't know.
I don't know. In today's world, it's hard to say. But no, I've always been passionate about the way nations interact, and I've always been passionate about technology. In terms of a career, I kind of grew up just focused on what's the next step. And when I got out of college, I knew I was going right in the Army because I had an ROTC scholarship at Georgetown. When I got out of the Army, I kind of stumbled into technology. I always say I haven't had a career as much as I've had a series of things that I've done that when you string them all together, it's been good. And it's worked out very well for my family and I. But to me,
was there anything about like a mom or dad or uncle or family or someone that you knew that was into it that he drew from?
There's a variety of people over the years in my life, whether it was, football coaches when I was young, had the good fortune to play Pop Warner as a 10-year-old with a former Division I coach who had won a national title. And he retired and was coaching his grandson. His grandson didn't make the team. So learned a lot about like how to fight through adversity. But for sports and the military, you learn how to set and achieve goals in a team-based setting at an elite level. That's a critical takeaway. In terms of decision-making and thinking about what I'm going to do next, it's got to be fun, interesting, rewarding, and entrepreneurial because F.I.R.E, F-I-R-E, fun, interesting, rewarding, and entrepreneurial is something that when I sat back in the late 90s and tried to think through what is my framework for decision making personally and professionally, that's what I came back with. And that framework is undefeated in my life, whether it was the decision to start my last company, the decision to sell it, or the decision to join Crosslink. It's got to be fun. You got to love what you're doing and who you're doing it with. Yeah. It's got to be interesting to the point where it keeps you up at night. It's got to be rewarding both intrinsically and extrinsically. Extrinsically, you got to pay the bills. Intrinsically, you got to look in the mirror every morning, know for a fact that you're leaving the world a better place. Otherwise, you're just a freaking oxygen thief and you don't have any right to be here.
I love it.
Entrepreneurial, because you're learning and growing something new every day, month, whatever. So that's kind of how I think about the world.
F.I.R.E is a great framework. So Matt, beyond specific technical skills, what are the most crucial leadership attributes developed through challenging military or team-based experiences? What are these experiences that you consistently find that are either vital or surprisingly underdeveloped in executive candidates you evaluate?
I mean, generally, leadership, I think it even says it on our website, that is the trait I believe is most important in a founder. You need to lead by example. You need to take a we first, not a me first approach. The overuse of personal pronouns can be very, very frustrating. We accomplish things, I don't. It's really about finding a way to make the organization come together so that some of the parts, it comes together and is accretive. So the 1+1 is 3 to 5 to 10. And there are people out there, it tends to correlate with people who have a history of, setting and achieving goals in a team-based setting at an elite level. That's a skill set that is refined in the military. It's also refined in sports. And, and there are a bunch of other ways where you can find experiences that reinforce the concept. But sports and the military are two that are pretty consistent. It's kind of, there are certain schools you can hire from where you're like, I don't know if this person's any good at their job, but they can't be a dummy because they got into that place. So that's kind of how I think about the leadership.
That's a great way of thinking about it. Can you make that 1 + 1 into 3, or 1 + 1 or 2 + 2 into 10, right? Can you do that? And the best leaders know how to do that really,
and
really
that's
well.
A transferable skill set. When I'm counseling veterans transitioning to the private sector, they're like, all right, as an Army Ranger, I can jump out of airplanes and shoot really well. What does that mean in the private sector? Well, it's like, well, you also commanded 150 people and you got them to set and achieve goals in a team-based setting at an elite level. Turns out in the corporate world, if you can do that, you're going to be incredibly successful and probably make yourself and your shareholders a lot of money.
Yeah, there's discipline and understanding of leadership and understanding of team that you get trained at scale. All right, I got some personal, thank you for opening up some of these personal questions. So I got some more. All right, this is I'm sure a favorite of yours. Your son Hunter was drafted by the Cubs in 2019. Now he plays for the Tampa Bay Rays. I know that you have notifications on whenever he's pitching. So Hunter was also a physics major at Harvard. How did you identify and support Hunter's unique passions and talents, both in science and competitive athletics, so that he could develop specific superpowers rather than conforming to a single path?
We really tried to, let him do what he was interested in. We never, I was an athlete, but certainly not at his level. But we always just tried to say, all right, if you're interested in something, we're going to do what we can to support it within reason. And, a little bit of coaching along the way. He was really, really into math. Math and science broadly, and over conversations, him and I kind of vectored in on physics. Really, he vectored in on physics because he loved the way the math would interface with the physical world. And at first he was thinking engineering, but then we took a step back, and and his theory was all engineering is just applied physics.
That's
so
true.
If I really want to understand how things work in a manner that's going to be useful through technology cycles, physics is probably more useful. And he's always had a very advanced approach to thinking about the world around him. And I think that's benefited him both in terms of physics, where he was doing, CRISPR research way before any of us had heard about it, or in baseball, where, he's one of 240 relief pitchers in the major leagues. Yeah. And if you're one of 240 in the world at what you do, you're probably doing pretty well.
Right. There's a tremendous amount of focus and sacrifice and discipline to get yourselves, and raw innate ability too, that's honed. So it's pretty amazing. I'd say definitely when as you know, I have 4 kids, and I have we had a similar approach. Find what they like to do, expose them to many things, and then whatever they really like to do, help them go deep to the extent that we could.
Yeah.
And then let them flourish to the level that they want to go with. But if you get good at one thing, if you can help them get good at one thing, you can take that anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the transferability of skill set and understanding at the meta level, what are the elements of the skill set that are transferable? And that to me is why leadership is so critical, and demonstrated leadership prior to starting a business. Because at the end of the day, any business is just a team that needs to execute at a high level. And if you have a history of getting teams to do that, it says a lot about you.
You can do anything, yeah. All right. What's a piece of conventional wisdom that everyone around you accepts, but you secretly think might be wrong?
There are so many. A favorite interview question. Do you jaywalk? Like, why would I waste time at an intersection that's empty just because the light says so?
I'm a jaywalker. Luckily, they don't have robot drones watching me. Okay.
Yet.
It's coming. Was there a historical event or person or movement that it really inspired you? Is there a person in particular that just lights you up?
I mean, I wouldn't say there's any one individual. I take a pretty broad-based approach to that one. I mean, whether it's, the guidance of Kevin Compton, who's just an amazing human, incredibly successful venture capitalist. Kevin's been very, very kind to me over the years. And, honestly, I feel like every time I talk to him, I just get smarter. And then it wears off and I have to go see him again. So there's folks like that, or, Colonel Joe Bonnet, who is a professor of mine in ROTC at Georgetown, who was somebody who really taught me a lot about leading by example. And there have just been a number of them over the years. Paul Meggers, who was my last boss in the Army, Paul taught me a lot about, perseverance and executing through difficult times and being a leader when things are, it's not easy to lead by example when you haven't slept in days, you're out of food, like all kinds of crazy things that happen in the woods. But, those are just a few. Heck, my wife, my son, just watching the way he had a really bad injury senior year of high school, and to watch him persevere through that.
That's really hard to come back by, right? Because I mean, it put him off his path towards the major leagues, right? But
absolutely. Yeah. And, the way
but he fought through it.
Yeah, he fought through it, figured out a way to do it. And, his intestinal fortitude through his journey is something that my son has taught me.
Do you have a favorite life motto that you come back to all the time with friends, work, or life?
I mean, the FIRE thing is really
I love the FIRE thing.
Deal.
Yeah, I think you nailed it with that.
Fun, interesting, rewarding, and entrepreneurial. And if you live by that, at least for me, and I think we all have to have our own personal version of it, but, for me, that's been immensely instructive, and, it just kind of keeps me on the right path.
Yeah. What's a seemingly small act of kindness or generosity you've received that had a disproportionately large impact on you?
I think, I'll go back to Joe Bonnet, Lieutenant Colonel, lead professor of military science, Georgetown University, probably 1990. And Joe pulled me aside. And at the time, I was working a full-time job, carrying a full-time load of classes, and still trying to play football and doing ROTC. It was ugly, and that was really where the we not me concept really got hammered into my brain, because Colonel Bonnet really helped me understand that by spreading myself too thin, I was being a bad team player. And, that was a turning point in my life, and really helped me understand that by focusing on something, I could get good at it. If I got good at it, I would enjoy it. If I enjoy it, I'm going to get better at it. And that sort of virtuous cycle, I think, is important. And it kind of gets back to everything in life is hard until you learn how to do it. Then it's just work. And if it's work you enjoy, you can get really good at it.
Yeah. So if you had to teach a master class on something that's not your job, something that you're passionate about, and we covered quite a few of those, what would the course be called?
I mean, I'd probably wrap it around FIRE. I've also I kind of geek on sociology a bit as well, just understanding how to see the world through other people's eyes, so that you can, because you can't engage people in mutually beneficial transactions unless you can empathize with them to the point where you can see the world through their eyes and understand why they make the decisions they make. So when I was running the last company, we were hanging out in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and all these combat zones. They have a very different cultural framework. So it's really, really hard to engage in business with them unless you can see the world through their eyes.
All right. So I got your name. I got the name, Fire and Eyes.
There we go.
All right. What's your personal moonshot?
My son.
I love it.
He's the best startup I've ever backed.
There's nothing better than backing your kids and seeing them grow and become something you never imagined. Or go beyond your imagination.
This is great, Reggie. I really appreciate you taking the time today. This is awesome.
Yeah. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. It was a thrill, as always, to sit and chat with you. Hope we can have you again sometime. And I think you brought a lot out. You brought a lot of great insights out for us. You helped us understand defense and technology and venture investing, leadership, and what are things we want to think about as we raise our kids. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And glad to come back anytime. Always great catching up.
Hey, so that was really interesting. Love having Matt on the show. He and I have had so many great conversations together, and bringing it to you is just one of the special thrills I get to do. As you know, I love learning about technology, innovation, disruption. And so looking at it come together in the context of the different wars and battles that we're fighting, it's the David versus Goliath nature of what people are able to do when under extreme circumstances is what's really interesting about what's happening with Ukraine beyond them being so threatened and their lives being so deeply impacted and affected, and how people act under that fire. And what we learned in the conversation with Matt is seeing some of those things ahead of time and preparing for it and building an innovation ecosystem around it so that when the time comes, you're ready. That understanding, seeing things before they happen, thinking about the people in your life who affect you, and then bringing it all together as part of your life journey. So thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the pod, please take a moment to rate it and comment. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and everywhere podcasts can be found. The show is produced by Anand Shah, edited by Sean Marr, Aidan McGarvey, and Laura Ballant. I'm your host, Rajiv Parikh from Position Squared, an AI-focused growth marketing company based in Silicon Valley. Come visit us at position2.com. This has been an F.I.R.E production, and we'll catch you next time. And remember, folks, be ever curious.